The following is a concise guide to the aesthetics paper. We'll go over the paper in class. There's also a paper guide, a PDF file available on Blackboard, but this will provide a quick overview of the paper so you have an idea as to what it's about, how to write it, etc. But again, you'll want to look at the more detailed paper guide, and also when you talk about it in class, it'll be in more detail as well. Now, before writing the paper, the first step is selecting your case, which is basically you'll be picking a particular issue in the case and writing about it. And a case is a topic. For example, one case is the question of, but is it art? And it deals with picking a controversial work and arguing that it is art or is not art. For example, there is apparently an artist who, what they do is they go places and they fill up shoes or boots with butter and leave them in unusual places, like the top of mountains, for example. And the question would be, of course, is something like a butter boot, is that art? And so the case, again, is about a particular subject. Another example would be, say, the issue of whether or not violent video games should be censored by the government. And so the case there would be about the violent video games. And the issue would be whether they should be censored or not. Now, the way to find the case is that on Blackboard, there'll be a PDF file with a variety of cases, ranging from such things as, again, like censorship, to moral issues, like whether the ethics of the person creating the work, or the work itself, should be relevant to the aesthetic assessment. So, for example, take the classic Triumph of the Will, basically a Nazi propaganda piece, but an excellent work of film and cinematography. And so one interesting question there is whether or not the content of the film, say the moral badness of it, has relevance to the aesthetic value of it. In other words, does evil lower aesthetic value? So the idea is to find a particular case that you're interested in writing about, and each one has an issue. An issue like, for example, whether or not violent video games should be censored, whether or not a particular work is art, or whether or not the moral content of a work is relevant to its aesthetic value, those sorts of things. Now, once you get your case and picked out your issue, the next thing to do is come up with your position on the issue. And that's where you take your stance. For example, if we go with, but is it art, or not, you would say, yes, it's art, or no, it's not. Or the example of censorship, you would say, yes, the government should censor violent video games, or no, they should not. So you need a clear statement on the position, a definite side. Then you consider various reasons, brainstorm reasons that support your position. Why, logically, should someone else believe that you are correct in your position? And come up with as many as you want. You come up with a whole bunch, and then you'll sort of winnow or weed them down when doing the paper. Now, when you actually get to the writing part, you'll want to label all three sections: the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. The reason why that's important is because when I grade it, I grade each section based on what the section is supposed to do. So it helps if I know what section you're presenting. And so be sure to label those three sections. Now, in regards to turning in the paper, if you do a draft, then turn in a printed copy to me. Either like in class, you can drop it off then. During my office hours, you can drop it off in my drop envelope. Just be sure to get it to me well before the draft deadline, which is specified in the syllabus, and there's more in the paper guide about this. The drafts have to be printed, because I like to sit down and mark it up. And I'll mark up paper, get it back to you as soon as possible, and then you can revise it or not, as you decide. Now, the final version of the paper is turned in through Blackboard. You have to upload it to Blackboard. Then what I do is I put comments on it in Blackboard through the text field, and then you'll be able to see your grade there. Now, once you get your grade, you're welcome to come in during office hours to discuss it. If you believe the grade is too low, you can come and discuss that. If you believe the grade is too high, you can discuss that as well. Now, when you come in for a grade discussion about the paper, be sure to print up a copy of the paper and bring it in so we can go over it. Because all I have on Blackboard is the electronic version. It's swiveling the monitor back and forth, kind of awkward. And the reason why I don't print papers for people is because, well, I usually get, like, if I'm lucky, one ring of paper per year. And of course, don't get toner that often, so printing up papers for everybody would quickly exhaust my limited resources. Now, one thing you definitely want to avoid is plagiarism. Everyone knows what that is, despite protests to the contrary, and it's a bad thing to do. Basically, the way plagiarism works is, copy someone else's work, don't properly cite it, get the zero. That's how it goes. I don't negotiate plagiarism. I just, confirm it, put the zero on it, and that's that. Unless, of course, someone really pushes it and wants academic misconduct, because that is an option. Now, in terms of formatting, I'm not really obsessed about that. Essentially, the paper should be readable. If you want to go for margins, if you want to say paper, ½ inch. If you want to go with a normal thing, 1 inch. If you want to try to create the impression the paper is longer than it is, 2, 3, 4, 5 inches. But if you want to avoid wasting paper, probably not good to get too ridiculous. In terms of the fonts, go with a normal, easy-to-read font. None of that weird script stuff. If you're at a loss, something like Times. Kind of boring, but straightforward, easy to read. Spacing, generally double spacing is, for the draft is a good idea. Easy to read, easy to mark up. For the, version you upload to Blackboard, not as critical, but double spacing still okay. Now, as far as, quoting, using, footnotes and endnotes, go with whatever you normally do in your major, or whatever you happen to learn in English class, APA, MLA, whatever. You don't have to learn a new style. If you don't have outside sources, be sure to get a copy of, a guide for that, or you can look at the paper guide, which includes, the basics of how to cite a source. It doesn't, lay out a particular style, but shows you how to do, a basic footnote or endnote. Now, for the introduction, pretty straightforward. It's worth 5 points. Should be 125 words or less. In terms of what goes in there, you should have your thesis statement, tell the reader what you're writing about, your case statement, tell the reader about your case, your position statement, what is your position on the issue, your argument statement, which states to the reader very briefly how you're going to argue, and some minimal background. Now, you may be able to obviously put together, multiple points into a single sentence. You might be able to present your thesis, your case, and your position all in one sentence. You might say, for example, I'll be writing about the issue of the censorship of video games. My view is that video games should not be censored, and I'll argue for it by using analogies, arguments by example, and a moral argument. That, for example, would cover most of the points in a single sentence. And so the idea is, again, the way I grade it is I look to see if the 5 points are there. If they are, 5 for 5. If not, less for 5. And again, it should be 125 words or less, because it's only worth 5 points. You don't want to write on and on and on just for 5 points out of 100. Now, the body is the main part of the paper. It's worth 90 points, and it should be about 500 words. Not because I brutally and rigorously enforce, a word count. It's because to make a decent argument, you're going to need at least 500 words, probably 750, perhaps more. But as a minimum, shoot for at least 500. Now, the first part of the body is just your case information. This is kind of like you normally do a report. You basically say what it's about, whatever background is needed for the reader. For example, if you're doing a case on, but is it art, that's where you describe the work. If you're doing a case on, say, censoring video games, you provide some information about that, some background about it, some of the existing policies, etc. Now, this should be pretty short, because the paper is not designed to be a report, it's designed to be an argumentative paper. And one way to sort of guide your effort is keep in mind it's worth 10 points. So if you go on and on and on writing about a report and explaining, etc., and giving examples, you're only getting 10 points for all of that. So you'll want to plan accordingly. Now, once you've laid out the case information, so the reader knows what's going on, state your position on the issue. It has to be a definitive position. It can't be, let's compare and contrast, or there are many opinions. You've got to take a definite position. So, for example, you might say, yes, this is art, or no, it is not art. or violent video games should be censored, or should not be, whatever your position happens to be. Now, the big chunk of the body, the 80 points, is arguments that support your position. Now, we'll spend the first part of the course going over how to argue in general and how to argue in aesthetics in particular. But the overall idea is you need to back up your position with reasons that support it. And that's sort of the key part of the paper. It's worth 80 points out of 90, so that's the part you really want to focus on. And again, we'll spend the entire first part of the course going over how to do that. Now, in terms of how the body is graded, it's basically graded in terms of how well it does what it's supposed to, which is, for the 10 points, does it provide adequate case background so the person knows what you're talking about? Do you state your position, and do you argue in support of your position? If this is done with excellence, then that would be excellent. If it's a good job of missing, a few bits here and there, it'd be good. If it just gets the job done, you state your position, you get some case information, you get some okay arguments, that's a C, gets the job done. If there's some defects in there, kind of unclear, poorly written, weak arguments, it's poor, kind of the D range. And if it's really bad, ranging from, nothing, which would be obviously 0, up to, pretty bad, which would be, quite a bit less point, more than 0, but less than 80, that'd be a failing one. So it's assessed basically on the quality of the writing, organization, clarity, presentation, but most importantly, on the quality of the argumentation. And as I mentioned, we'll spend most of part 1 going over how to argue in general and how to argue in aesthetics in particular. Now, the conclusion is basically sort of the bookend to the introduction. It's worth 5 points, 125 words or less, and contains almost all the same stuff. The thesis, case statement, position statement, argument statement, and, instead of the background, a final relevant remark. So what you can do, sort of a quick tip, is copy introduction, paste it to your conclusion, go from I will to I did, and swap out the final, relevant remark, put that in place of the, minimal background, and your conclusion is done. Now, here are some common mistakes that are grade killers. The first one is to simply write a report, to do, say, a report on, a particular artist, like Picasso, or to write a report on the history of censorship of video games, or to write a report on jazz, or to write a report on a movie, like, Thor, or the Avengers. And so if you're just writing a report or arguing, that's bad. Second common mistake, writing a compare and contrast paper, comparing, say, jazz with smooth jazz, with not so smooth jazz, or comparing, say, science fiction with, say, fantasy. Now, compare and contrast papers could be fine for a compare and contrast sort of scenario, but the objective of this paper is to argue. Now, you could argue that, say, science fiction is a variation of fantasy, or you could argue that fantasy is a variation of science fiction, but that's not comparing and contrasting. That's actually arguing. So if you're just comparing and contrasting things, not the right thing for this paper. Third, the most common one is simply to assert things with no arguments, just saying violent video games should not be censored, and just saying it over and over again in various ways, or saying it's not art. Now, you got to make an assertion to back your position, to make your position known, but without arguments, you got nothing aside from a position. So the most common mistake is simply making claims without backing them up. And again, we'll go over in great detail as to what an argument is. Now, a fourth common mistake is to argue, but not really argue aesthetically. For example, a person might argue about the legality of censoring video games and write a paper, say, on the First Amendment. Now, that'd be an argument, but if you do like a legal paper, that would be not really an aesthetic paper. It might be on video games, but a legal paper on video games is not thus an aesthetic paper. So what you want to do is make sure that when you're writing on, you might involve legality, but you want to make sure it ties into aesthetics. And the way to tell is to look at the cases, look at those topics. But the shortest way is to check with me with the draft, or just ask me, if I argue like this, am I doing like an aesthetic argument, or am I doing something like a legal argument or something else? Another common mistake is to go on a non-approved topic. Now, in addition to the cases that I make available, you can also come up with your own topic. And actually I encourage this, because that way if you pick your own topic, you're more likely to find something that you're interested in, or at least less bored about. Now, the reason why I require that people run the topic by me is not to crush their freedom or restrict their creativity. It's to avoid a person doing a paper on something that has nothing to do with aesthetics, turning their final draft without, final version without checking with me, and getting a horrible grade. What people sometimes do is recycle papers from other classes. And of course, if it's on something like, psychology or raising children, or techniques of teaching finger painting to first graders from, say, an education class, they won't have anything to do with actual aesthetics. So be sure that your topic is actually relevant to the class. It may be a great paper on, say, techniques of raising children, or a great paper on the psychology of, say, voter suppression. But if it's nothing to do with aesthetics, it's got nothing to do with aesthetics. So as a grade sort of safety thing, a good idea to have you check the topic and you come up with your own. And it's also very good, of course, to do a draft. That way I can check it for you in more detail. And of course, a very common mistake is plagiarism. What often happens is, it gets right to the final deadline, and someone realizes, oh crap, I haven't done my paper yet. It's due in half an hour. Wikipedia, save me. Now, my general view is this. Plagiarism is bad. And so if you're considering plagiarism, don't do it. Because the paper gets uploaded to SafeAssign. It's pretty good at spotting stuff. Gives me a nice report, all the links, etc. What I see is plagiarized. Again, I know what's been done. The person who's plagiarized knows what's been done. There's nothing to negotiate. The zero goes on there. Possibility for active misconduct, blah, blah, blah. So my advice is don't plagiarize. So if you're stuck, like at the last minute, you're thinking, Wikipedia, can you save me? Don't resist the temptation. You're better off just writing anything of your own than doing the plagiarism stuff. Because if you do something and it's relevant, you'll get at least some points. But if it's plagiarism, that's always bad. But of course, it's best to do your paper well in advance, do drafts, and that way you get a good grade. But if it comes down to desperation, better to slap the keyboard as fast as you can than to plagiarize. Now, I've included in the paper guide a handy checklist, which lists the common things that hurt grades, and you're not required to put the checklist into your paper. It's just something to look at, kind of a pre-flight thing, before you upload your paper. Now, when you do a draft, one thing when you get it back, you'll see these apparently mysterious letters and numbers. And what those are comment codes. What I found over the years is that I say the same thing over and over on papers, like this needs to be clearer, or support this, or argue for that. And rather than writing it out over and over again, I just put down a nice little letter and a number. And so to see what those mysterious, symbols and glyphs mean, just go to the paper guide, go to the comment sheet, look at the comment codes, and that will tell you what those comments mean. Now, if I have to say something that I don't have a comment code for, then I'll write it on the paper as neatly as possible. But that's where to find the comment codes. So that's the basics for the aesthetic paper. For more details, be sure to look at the paper guide. We'll also be talking about this in some detail in class.